Hello, this is Alan Barton and welcome to this first session in this introductory course on medieval stained glass. In this session today, I'm going to talk about glassmaking in the pre-industrial age. I'm going to explore with you how sheets of glass were produced without mechanization. Sheets of glass that would be the raw material that glass painters and glaziers would use for their windows. I'm going to explore that subject by looking at a whole series of interesting images, illustrations from medieval manuscripts, woodcuts and engravings from the 16th, 17th and 18th century, all of which provide an insight into how glass was made. I'm going to talk about the raw materials and where they could be found, how coloured glass was produced, and lastly, where, both in Great Britain and on the continent, that raw material of glass could be found. Now, this wonderful manuscript illumination is a great place for us to start as we explore glassmaking. It's an illumination dating from the early years of the 15th century, from between 1410 and 1420, and is part of a French manuscript in the British Library of Sir John Mandeville's Travels. The illustration is supposed to be of miners and glassmakers mining the pit of Memnon in Palestine. Memnon was a centre of glassmaking production in antiquity in Palestine. But what is illustrated here is not a Palestinian glass house at all, but a Northern European glass house. We see the raw materials being provided for the manufacture of the glass, and below that a glass house with a kiln within. So, to begin with, what is glass? Well, glass really is superheated and cooled silica. It is sand. But in order to melt sand and produce glass, the melting temperature of the silica has to be reduced. So the raw material, sand, is mixed with wood ash, potash from trees. So generally speaking, glass houses were found where you had those two basic components, where you had a pit of good quality sand and you also had an abundance of trees that could be used to produce the potash and also to fire the kiln. And at the top of this illumination from John Mandeville's Travels of the Pit of Memnon, you see in the centre there a sand pit, a man digging at it with the spade, while other workmen cart off in troughs that raw material sand. And the sandpit, as you will see, is set within the context of a clearing of woodland with trees around, and evidence that they've been cleared too. At the bottom of this image of the pit of Memnon, we have a glass house itself where glass is being produced, and what's being produced here is not window glass at all, but seemingly glass vessels, vases and jugs and that sort of thing, which are being blown by hand. Now what we have here is the kiln in the centre, where the sand and the potash are united and the sand is melted to produce that basic glass. You've got a chap here on the right hand side who's stoking the furnace, and you've got two glass blowers in front. One, he's just putting in his glass blowing pipe in order to extract some molten glass from this pot here, this ceramic pot. So the sand and the potash are put into ceramic pots to be heated and melted in the furnace. And he's just about to extract a blob of molten glass onto the end of his blowing pipe. This chap at the front here is in the process of blowing a glass vessel. Now we'll come on to what's going on this side a little bit later. You'll notice that the glass house is not a solid structure, but is a rather rickety looking timber structure. There are two reasons for this. Firstly, glass blowing is hot work, and having basically a timber roof over the top of the kiln with open sides allows the air in to make life a little bit more bearable for the glass blowers. But secondly, it's a dangerous business. Quite often glass kilns would set on fire, and they would set on fire a more elaborate structure. So the structures placed over the top of them simply consisted of temporary roofs that could be easily and cheaply replaced with all that timber that's lying around a medieval glass house. So here we see glass vessels being produced in a kiln that is built of brick and of clay, a very simple structure indeed. Now this is a really fascinating illustration from the 1580s showing a German glass kiln. It's taken from a book called De Rare Metallica on the nature of metals, which was published by an author called George Bauer, or George Agricola as he was Latinized as. Bauer and Agricola both meaning farmer. It's a really instructive illustration. It seems in this case that the glass kiln is situated outside. There's no covering over the top of it. It's conical in form, you will notice, and most glass kilns, even into the 18th and early 19th century, were conical in form. It seems to have been the most efficient form of kiln in order to keep the appropriate temperature for melting the glass. You'll notice this cone kiln is made of brick, some of it's exposed, render falling off, and it has these reinforcements over the top, these bars. I don't know what they're made of, perhaps of stone, they might even be made of metal, probably of stone I would have thought. And there are openings all the way around this kiln, in which of course those pots would have been kept to melt the glass. And quite a number of glass blowers are able to use this one kiln. They're all the way around there, blowing drinking vessels, it seems, in this case. Now you'll notice at the bottom of the illustration here is a crate full of the completed wares, which have that lovely green tinge of handmade glass. And between these two chaps here are a couple of stone moulds that could form the vessels decoratively. And right at the top appears to be a bar here, or a pub, and there's a gentleman pouring himself a nice glass of liquid refreshment into one of the finished vessels. And off to one side here we've got a chap carting the vessels away. So it shows the basic form continued from the Middle Ages of the glass kiln, a conical shaped kiln with those openings around that could be accessed by the glass makers, by the glass blowers for their work. Now, one part of the process you don't see in the illumination from Sir John Mandeville's Travels, but you do see in a separate woodcut from De Re Metallica by Agricola, is a process called fritting, a process that took place directly before the molten glass was produced. Fritting was a process that took place over 1 or 2 days, and in a low temperature kiln the sand and the ash were mixed together really thoroughly to allow the ash to coat every particle of the sand. and that sped up the eventual melting process and produced a much smoother product. Now we see this in this illustration from Lorraine Metallica. There is the fritting oven in the background there. There's a workman in the front who's breaking up the raw materials, and there's some kindling for the fire. So it appears to be a fritting oven. Until the 19th century and all the way through the Middle Ages, glass was made in two forms, both hand-blown forms. The first you see on the left-hand side is crown glass, where a circle of glass is blown, and I'm going to describe that process in a moment. The second is broadsheet glass, where a cylinder of glass is blown and then is further processed into workable window glass. Because of the way that crown glass is made, some parts of the circle of glass are more workable than others and more applicable for the use in stained glass windows. The centre of the glass, where it's attached to the blowpipe, which we'll see in a moment, is often considerably thicker than the edges and the margins of the glass. But each had an application. You may remember in years past seeing oldie worldy pubs with windows very similar to the one on the right hand side here, with the centres of glass crowns leaded in and used. Now, the illustration I'm going to use to describe the processes of making crown glass dates from the 18th century and is a wonderful engraving from Diderot and Laurent d'Alembert's Encyclopédie, printed in Paris in 1765. Although it's an 18th century illustration, it is identical. All the processes are identical to those used in the late Middle Ages. So it's a wonderful resource for us to understand those processes. And what we see here is the interior of a Parisian glasshouse in the 1760s, and it's not much different from those of the Middle Ages. So a big timber roof, and in the centre here is the kiln, the main glass kiln, and on the top here you've got piles of firewood which are drying on top of the kiln to use to stoke it with. The fire hole is on this side here, and this man's the stoker, and there are little openings here, here and here from which glass can be extracted, and all the glass blowing activity is taking place on this side here. So let's zoom in to the next slide. Okay, so here we are zoomed into the activity that's occurring on the right hand side. So just here you've got a man called the gatherer who is gathering a lump of molten glass and placing it on the end of the blowpipe. He then goes and hands it to this gentleman here, who blows it into a longer tube. Then that's passed to this gentleman here, who widens it out on one end, and then beyond him is a further worker who is blowing it into more of a ball shape, and on this side here you've got a chap who, through centrifugal force, has created a crown of glass from that ball shape. Okay. And in the next slide, which are a whole series of engravings of this process, show how the glass goes from this long cylinder into a crown of glass. So Diderot gives us 6 engravings that show the process in detail. So once the gatherer has removed what's called the gather of glass, the small ball of molten glass, and attached it to the blowpipe, then it's given to the first worker. And you can see him here beginning to blow the glass into a cylindrical form. And he's doing this over the top of a trough and against a metal rail as support as he's doing it. Now the second worker takes over, and then he blows that shape into a globe shape, a larger globe shape. You can see that occurring here. Again, over this large trough and against this metal bar. Now this is where the magic starts to happen. A third worker is given that globe and he works it in front of an open furnace. You can see here on the left hand side. And he spins it continuously, and by the power of centrifugal force in front of that furnace, it gradually forms a crown of circular glass, as you see here on the right hand side. So it's entirely through blowing and then centrifugal force to form that crown, that plate of glass. So then the process of annealing the glass begins. And the glass is laid down on what is described by Diderot as a pelote of glass, which is a layer of pressed and compacted sand, and the crown is laid onto that to settle, and then the blowpipe is removed, and you can see that's occurring here now in this left-hand illustration. And then after that, the crown of glass is removed and it's clearly put down excuse me, onto something else. A board perhaps, I don't know, or a board covered in pressed sand. It's not really very clear. And then is placed into the annealing oven for its final tempering. Now, this is how most window glass was produced from the 13th century all the way through to the beginning of the 20th century, when plate glass processes come into being, float glass, etc., and pressed glass. And it must have been absolutely back-breaking work. And look at these two illustrations from the beginning of the 20th century, photographs of glass workers holding these huge crowns of glass. They must have weighed a ton, and it must have taken considerable strength and manual dexterity as well as skill to be able to turn the blowpipe to produce these large crowns of glass through centrifugal force. The other method of making window glass is to make what is called broadsheet window glass. And this is produced in much the same way as glass drinking vessels are produced, by being blown rather than through centrifugal force. So a gatherer gets a glob of molten glass on the end of the blowpipe, and the glass worker then blows a long cylinder enclosed at one end. When this is cut off the blowpipe, it forms a long cylinder called a muff that then has to go through certain other procedures before it can form part of a window. Okay, so here on the left hand side we have a muff of glass enclosed on one end, a broken end here where it was attached to the blowpipe, and then it has to be further processed to make it into window glass. A hot iron is taken and is laid across the full length of this glass to create a crack. Now on this little collection of 8 muffs you can see here, you can see where they've been cracked along the long edge. After that, they are put into the annealing oven and they're laid upon a flat bed of sand. And both gravity and heat opens up the muff and forms a flat piece of window glass. Because of course this is a hand-blown product, the thickness of the glass will vary from one end to the other, just as it does with a piece of crown glass. So after being formed into either a crown or a muff of broadsheet glass, the glass still had to go through a further process before it was complete. And that process was called annealing. The glass would be gradually cooled down over a period of 4 to 5 days to prevent any stresses appearing in the glass and any cracks, fractures or fissures. Now in this woodcut from De Re Metallica, in this case from 1556, we can see that annealing oven. On this side is the main glassmaking kiln with all its openings for the glassmakers to use. And here is the annealing kiln with a coffered roof, a firing hole in the base and an opening in the side. And the glass would be laid out in the annealing oven on a bed of sand to cool over this 4 to 5 day period. Once cool, and once that glass was tempered, it could then be shipped out to the glaziers for them to use. Now it's quite possible for a skilled glassmaker to change the colour of their glass simply by altering the conditions, the temperature of the kiln they were working with. Now at this point I'm going to introduce to you somebody who's going to be a key figure, and I'm going to talk to you about him in the next session too. That person is a monk, a Benedictine monk who lived at the end of the 11th and the beginning of the 12th century, called Theophilus the Presbyter, a Benedictine monk who was living near Cologne. And he wrote an extraordinary craft manual called De Diversis Artibus, the diverse arts. He was a really very skilled man indeed. He worked in metalwork and enamel, as well as making glass and also painting it and putting together stained glass windows. And he leaves a really detailed set of instructions as to how this process works. So he says by simply altering and raising the temperature of the kiln you're working with, you can shift the colour of your glass from a saffron yellow colour through to a reddish yellow, to then a tawny colour like flesh, then with further heating to a light purple, and then even shift it to a reddish purple. It's extraordinarily skilled work, this. You can imagine the kilns that they're working with then have no form of temperature gauge. Everything has to be done by feel. Extraordinarily skilled. Now you can see in this panel here of 13th century glass from Lincoln Cathedral some of those colours that Theophilus appears to be talking about, presumably produced with this temperature shifting. We've got here the tawny colour like flesh that he's describing. We've got saffron yellows and deeper reddish yellows. We've got light purples and reddish purples of the sort that he is describing, all presumably produced through this particular process. It is really quite remarkable. Now how this happens is a bit of chemistry here. Under the redox conditions of the kiln, the iron and manganese oxides, which are naturally present in beech wood ash and initially give the glass a green colour, react and the colour shifts. Now some colours were only achieved by adding extra ingredients to the molten glass while it was in the kiln. Blue glass, for example, required the use of cobalt oxide in various quantities to produce various shades of blue. Green glass and some yellows required the addition of iron oxide to the pot. Now because these metals are added to the pot and also the colour changes described by Theophilus occur in the pot while the glass is molten and still in the kiln, we refer to these solid coloured glasses in art historical terms as pot metal glass. Most red glass had to be produced in a rather different way. Red glass was produced by adding copper oxide to glass, but the glass it produced was completely opaque. So generally speaking, in the medieval period, molten red glass would be applied as a layer to an existing glass surface to give some translucency to the finished glass. This surface layering of red glass on top of white is known as flashed ruby glass, and it can produce some fabulous striations which can be used for good visual effect in windows. So if we look at this panel from Lincoln Cathedral from the early 13th century, once again we can see all of those glass colouring techniques in use in the glass in this panel. Now we've got that kiln temperature colour change process demonstrated by these wonderful pink flesh tones of these heads and the saffron yellow body of this demon here. Also by this murrey colour. Murrey is the heraldic term for purple, which we tend to use to describe medieval glass. So these wonderful purpley tones, again, different tones here, lighter and darker, quite striated again because it's a natural process of those that manganese reacting with the temperature change in the kiln. And we've got lots of metal oxide colour here too. Lots of cobalt blue in the borders and the background of the panel here. We've got iron oxide greens here and also here, and what is probably an iron oxide yellow here too. Again, how you achieved a yellow rather than a green to do with the temperature that your kiln is kept at. But the pièce de résistance, I think, are the copper oxide flashed ruby elements. In these borders here, you can see the wonderful mottled striations through there. And the head of the demon is a wonderful piece of stripy flashed ruby glass. So all of those coloration techniques can be seen in this particular panel. Now we did make some glass in medieval England, but not very much of it, and the quality appears to have been a little bit dubious. The centre of English window glass production appears to have been the Weald in the southeast of England, particularly the area surrounding the village of Chiddingfold in Surrey, just on the border between Surrey and Sussex, right in the heart of the Weald. Now we know that in 1240 there was a glassmaker called Lawrence Vitterius, Lawrence the glassmaker, living there. He was a landowner of 40 acres and was presumably running a glassmaking business, and that the trade continued for at least another 100 years in Chiddingfold. In 1351 and 1355, John Allemain of Chiddingfold was commissioned to make white glass both for St Stephen's Chapel in Westminster, the Chapel Royal, and for the new Chapel of the Order of the Garter, St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle. You couldn't get a more high status commission if you tried, so the glass couldn't have been too bad. The glass he was producing was white glass, opaque glass without colour. Now the conditions of the Weald are absolutely perfect for glass making. You'd got lots of beech trees and you'd got lots of sand, all the raw materials you need to make glass, and the fuel supply you need to feed the kilns. There were other small areas of production in England, in Staffordshire and Shropshire and Cheshire, but they were small. English glass was generally of such inferior quality that patrons often went out of their way to stipulate that only foreign glass should be used in their glazing commissions. For example, when the Beauchamp Chapel in St Mary's, Warwick was glazed by John Prudd in the 1440s, he was ordered to use glass from beyond the seas and with no glass of England. The primary source of this glass from beyond the seas was the near continent, Normandy, and also Flanders and Lorraine, the latter glass being known as Rhenish glass. In 1318, when Exeter Cathedral was being glazed, 462 parcels of white glass and 203 parcels of coloured glass, each parcel or weighing in at £5, were shipped to Exeter across the Channel from Rouen in Normandy. Although we heard that the white glass for St Stephen's Chapel in Westminster came from Chiddingfold in 1351, the coloured glass was purchased at the warehouses of the Hanseatic merchants. So there were all these ships going across the Channel from the near continent up the north, up the east coast to York and other places, filled with quantities of coloured glass. When the York glazier John Petty died in 1508, through that trade he had both Normandy and Rhenish glass in stock for his windows. Well, although we were pretty terrible at making glass in medieval England, as you will see in the rest of this course, our glaziers were really rather good at taking this foreign made glass, painting it and putting it together into beautiful windows.